Ever find yourself scrolling through social media and you just get this like nagging feeling? Like that statistic you just saw, maybe about, oh, I don't know, the latest internet challenge or something, just doesn't feel right.
Oh, absolutely. Happens to me all the time.
Right. And it's like, why don't we trust our gut more often?
We should, because more often than not, it's right.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is why we're doing this deep dive today. We're tackling the world of statistics.
Music to my ears.
Now, before anyone panics, no, we're not channeling our inner high school math teachers or anything.
No pop quizzes here.
But wouldn't it be awesome to have some tools to really decode all the data that's thrown at us every single day?
Think of it like a superpower for the digital age.
Exactly. And to help us unlock that superpower, we're going deep into this really cool math textbook chapter. It's all about the core concepts of statistics.
It's all about giving you the knowledge to be a more informed citizen. Because data, as we'll see, can be pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely. But before we get to the whole power part, we got to lay some groundwork, right?
Back to basics.
We're talking data itself. You know, it's funny. This textbook actually reminded me that data isn't just like numbers on a screen. It's information. Information we gather from, well, everywhere.
It's the building blocks of how we understand the world.
Think about it. Every time you do a quick Google search, you're interacting with tons of data.
Or even something as simple as checking the weather app in the morning. Data.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Now, speaking of gathering information, the textbook dives into this thing called primary versus secondary data collection. I'll admit, when I first read it, I was like, ugh, technical terms. But then it clicked.
What clicked?
Well, imagine you're like a journalist working on a huge story.
Right.
You could go out there, interview people, dig through archives. That's your primary data.
Or you could rely on other news sources, existing reports, things like that, that would be your secondary data.
Exactly. Both are super useful, obviously. But knowing where your information comes from, that's key.
Couldn't agree more. Helps you determine how much weight to give that information.
And that's true for anything, really. Whether you're trying to pick the best restaurant in town or you're knee-deep in a research project.
Knowing the source of your data is paramount.
Totally. Okay, so let's say we've got our data, right?
Got it.
What's next? Because a giant pile of raw data, especially if it's just numbers, that's not exactly helpful.
Overwhelming. More like it.
The textbook actually uses this example about student marks on a test, and the scores range from something like 25 to 95. Now imagine if the teacher just handed back a list with all those scores in random order.
Chaos.
Exactly. So instead, we can use something called a frequency distribution table.
It brings order to the chaos.
It shows you how many students scored within a certain range, and it suddenly makes the whole picture much clearer.
Makes it digestible.
Instead of a jumbled mess, it's like those puzzle boxes, where all the pieces are separated by color or pattern.
Love those.
Suddenly, it doesn't seem so daunting, right?
Definitely. But even with all the pieces sorted, you still have to put the puzzle together. You still need to understand the big picture.
And that, my friend, is where those fancy charts and graphs come in.
Visualizing the data.
They take all those nicely organized numbers and turn them into something we can really wrap our heads around.
They tell a story.
They do. And there's a whole art to it, as I'm sure we'll discover.
It's like, imagine if you're trying to understand the weather, right? But instead of looking at a weather map or a forecast, you just had this big list of temperatures.
Oh, that would be so hard to decipher.
Right. Like, you might eventually figure out the average temperature for the month, but you wouldn't see the patterns like, was there a heat wave? Did it gradually get colder?
It's amazing how much a simple graph can add to our understanding.
Our brains just process visual information so much better.
Totally agree. And speaking of graphs, I have to admit, when I first started reading about histograms and frequency polygons in this textbook, I thought to myself, when am I ever going to use this stuff in real life?
I know, right? It can feel very back to math class sometimes. But trust me, they're more common than you think.
Really?
Think about all those infographics you see online, especially on social media.
Oh, true.
A lot of them are using histograms and frequency polygons to make data more, eye-catching.
So we're being exposed to these statistical tools all the time, even if we don't realize it. But like we were saying earlier, not all data visualization is created equal.
Unfortunately not.
And this textbook does a great job of highlighting that with example 7.
The one with the misleading histogram.
That's the one. Can you walk us through it again? Because I remember feeling like, wait, am I missing something when I first saw it?
It's easy to be tricked by visuals. Basically, they show the same data in two different histograms.
Same data, different graphs.
Yep. And Depending on how they set up the intervals on the x-axis, they can make a certain group look way bigger or smaller than it really is.
It's like they're using statistics to pull a fast one.
In a way, yeah. But knowing that this kind of manipulation is possible, it's like you're suddenly more aware.
Exactly. It's like having a BS detector for statistics.
Precisely. Now you start looking at graphs and charts and questioning things. Why did they choose those intervals? Are they trying to influence my opinion?
It's all about being a critical thinker. Which brings us to another big idea from the textbook, finding the average.
Yes. Averages, or as we like to say in the biz, measures of central tendency.
Because it turns out there isn't just one type of average, is there?
Nope. The textbook uses this great example of two students, Mary and Hari, and they're arguing over who got the better test scores.
Classic classroom drama.
Right. But it highlights a really important point. We often throw around the word average without specifying which average we're talking about.
So what kind of averages are we working with?
Well, there's the one everyone knows, the mean. Add up all the values, divide by the total number of values, simple enough.
The classic average.
But then we have the median, which is the middle value when you line up all your data from least to greatest. And then there's the value that shows up most often.
Okay, so mean, median, mode. 3 different ways to look at the average. But how do we know which one to use in real life?
Well, the textbook makes the point that the clothing industry, for instance, they rely a lot on the mode.
Makes sense. They want to know what sizes to make the most of.
Exactly. But if we're talking about something like salaries, using the mean can be a bit misleading, especially if you've got a few people making a whole lot of money.
It's the whole Bill Gates walks into a bar problem, right?
Exactly. Suddenly, the average income of everyone in that bar just skyrocketed, even though nothing really changed for the other people there. That's where the median comes in handy.
Gives you a more realistic view of the typical person's salary.
Okay, so back to our test-taking duo, Mary and Hari. We've got these different ways of looking at their averages. Who wins?
Well, here's the thing. Even after crunching the numbers, looking at the mean, the median, even the mode for both of them, the textbook doesn't actually pick a winner. So, no clear victor in the battle of the averages.
Nope. And that's intentional, I think, because it drives home this point that just because we can calculate an average doesn't mean it tells the whole story.
Right. It's more about understanding what those numbers actually mean, what they tell us about the situation.
Exactly. And that's even more important when we start thinking about how statistics can be used sometimes to persuade.
Okay, so we've gone from statistics can be a bit misleading to statistics can be straight up manipulative. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, remember that example from the textbook with the factory workers? The one where they brought up the supervisor's salary?
Oh, right. To make a point about the mean income, wasn't it?
Exactly. They were trying to figure out the average salary at the factory, but because the supervisor made so much more than everyone else, the mean wasn't really an accurate representation of what the typical worker earned.
It's like when you see those news articles that talk about the average salary in a certain profession, but they don't clarify if they're including, like, CEO salaries in that calculation.
You hit the nail on the head. So it always pays to be a little skeptical, to think critically about how those numbers are being used.
It feels like we're learning a whole new language here, the language of questioning statistics. So for those of us who don't have a PhD in math, what are some things we should watch out for? Any red flags?
One big one is when statistics are presented without any context. Like, if you see a headline that screams, crime rate up 50%, it's natural to be alarmed.
Sounds scary.
But then you got to ask, 50% up from what? Compared to when? And what does that 50% actually look like in real terms?
So it's not just about the numbers themselves, it's about the story behind the numbers.
Exactly. And sometimes that story is being carefully curated. Another thing to be wary of is how data visualization is used. Because a graph can be incredibly persuasive, but it can also be misleading.
Right. We talked about that misleading histogram, but I'm sure there are tons of other ways to manipulate charts to make a point.
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole art form in itself. So the takeaway here is to stay vigilant.
Channel our inner data detectives, even when we're just scrolling through our phones.
Especially then. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to dig a little deeper, and to be critical of the information that's being presented to you.
This has been eye-opening. We've covered so much ground, from basic definitions to the potential pitfalls of statistics.
It's all connected.
It really is. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating world of statistics, what's the one thing we want our listeners to take away from today's conversation?
Statistics can be powerful, But the real power lies in understanding that they're not always objective, neutral tools.
Yeah.
They can be used to inform, but they can also be used to persuade, even to manipulate.
So it's up to us to be informed, to ask the right questions, and to think critically about the data we encounter.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this data-driven journey. It's been a pleasure picking your brain about all things statistics.
Anytime.